Making disciples is the primary mission of the church, and God uses the spiritual disciplines to transform us to be like Jesus. This week, we're talking about the spiritual disciplines of Sabbath and avoiding hurry with Brittany Feldott, Pastoral Associate at Cape Cod Church in East Falmouth, Massachusetts. I'm Charles Galda, President, Division New England, and your host for the Church in Action. Brittany, thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure.
And I should mention a board member of Vision New England, so my boss.
It's a privilege to be here and be part of the team.
Thanks. It's great to have you serve. I appreciate it. Brittany, though, for folks who may not know you and don't know Cape Cod Church, could you give a little bit of biography?
Yeah, sure. So as we mentioned, my name's Brittany. I grew up on Cape Cod in Falmouth, Massachusetts, and did not know necessarily what I wanted to be when I grew up, except I knew I wanted to work for and serving people. So when I went away to school, studied psychology, and then when I was 20, discerned a calling into ministry and took some time to figure out next steps for that. I was actually a news reporter for 2 years. I was a writer for 2 years for a local newspaper, and then went to divinity school to study systematic theology. And then thankfully, my home church, Cape Cod Church, took me back. And I've been here full time for a little over 3 years now. I also happen to be a pastor's kid. So our senior pastor, Ben Feldott, is my dad and my boss, which is a unique privilege. And I serve as our pastoral associate. So I wear a couple of hats. I do some preaching. I lead our young adult ministry here, work on some messaging and communication stuff in the background, and then about a dozen other things that we do when we're part of a team. And I feel very lucky to be here. It's a beautiful place, and it's changed a lot in the last 30 years since my parents founded it, but very privileged to be a part of it. So that's a little bit about me.
And you're not done with your education.
Well, that's true. Are any of us, but it's true. I am studying for a master's in biblical languages right now at Gordon Conwell, which has been really cool. They have an awesome online and in-person hybrid program. So I take some courses on campus, but a lot of it I do from the Cape so that I can continue serving here.
You picked, in my view, about the hardest focus for your studies that you can.
Well, I don't know.
I struggled with middle school German. I struggled with high school Spanish. I
will say, I was not awesome at languages when I was in I was fine, but wasn't my best subject. But it is a lot easier to study a language when you know why you're studying it and how you're going to put it to use. And being able to read scripture in its original language is really, when that's your homework, I mean, it makes it a lot easier to understand, okay, this is why I'm doing it, and get excited about it. So trying my best and enjoying it.
You may also study more than me, but let's leave that aside for now. So I know you agree that making disciples is the primary mission of the church, and the disciple is someone who looks like Jesus. Our research was that we're not good at this. Does that resonate with you?
I think that's fair. I mean, it's a broad sweep, but I would say it's a challenge for sure. Mm-hmm. And I think in the last couple of years, we've seen examples of being disappointed and maybe even a little bit surprised that people who say that they're Christians or identify as Christians weren't behaving like Jesus would have behaved. Mm-hmm. And that seems to suggest that that's something that we could continue to work on. How do we become more like Jesus? Because none of us is perfect at that, but it also seems like it's maybe a spot that the church can work on.
Yeah, and it's a good point. So I appreciate you being tactful about it. It's a pretty broad brush statement. It's not to imply nobody's growing spiritually and nobody's living like a disciple. But on the whole, that was the observation of the last few years, to your point, right? We've been shocked in some cases by folks we thought were the mature ones, right? And so now we've been talking about how the spiritual disciplines are what God uses to transform our hearts to be like Jesus and retrains our body. Are you still on board with that, or would you nuance it differently or speak about it differently?
No, I'm on board with that. It's a funny. We Charles and I talked about the questions a little bit in advance, or I saw the questions in advance, and it did make me laugh because Charles and I got into a small fight about some of the language around
a small dialogue.
Civil discourse. Which was really fun about language, because language is important and how you talk about things. And so we were talking about what does it mean to retrain the body, and is that separate from you and your mind, and how we divide those things. We had an interesting conversation just about that and what it implies for our responsibility and how we view ourselves. So But that aside, language aside, no, in general, yes, spiritual disciplines absolutely are something that's used to help us to become like Jesus. And actually, that insight for me is a really powerful one because I think growing up, I didn't think about it that way. I
Mhm.
thought of the spiritual disciplines or spiritual practices as something that you were supposed to do if you were a good Christian. I did not think about them as exercises or rhythms or practices that would help you become good or become like Jesus.
Yeah.
And there's a world of difference between the two. So yeah, it's been a powerful concept for me and totally agree.
I think you're right on that. I think your experience is the typical Christian's experience because I would say, I wasn't a Christian growing up, but when I spent 30 years before I founded upon that truth as well. And I love, we talked to Dr. Carrie Tibbles earlier today, and there's a quote she said just stuck in my mind. Our habits and our disciplines create our life.
Mm,
And so what those things are that we focus on, whether they're the spiritual disciplines or some other disciplines, are really going to drive who we are.
yeah, that's such a good point because I'm getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. But in my small group this past winter, we talked about Sabbath and rest and
Mhm.
unhurrying our lives. And one of the questions that stuck out to me is, who do you want to be in 10 years? And thinking about that, because the small decisions you make now and my daily rhythms are going to have an impact on who I am in 10 years. And when I looked, there were all sorts of things that I do now that are small but stack up that
Yeah.
weren't going to stack up to the things that I wanted to be when I look ahead at, 10 years from now.
Yeah, our old pastor, and I wish I had thought about it right when he would say this. Our old pastor would talk about that becoming a Christian, too many of us just try to add it on to our existing life, and it's not an add on. And I completely agreed with him, and I still do agree with him, but it would have hit me differently if he said, actually, becoming a Christian is a fundamental reordering of your life.
Mm,
Because so many of the things then, like some of the disciplines that we're talking about, is like, well, I can't make that work, right? Because of the commitments I have. And so I'm going to adapt as best I can to that, when the reality is, okay, so then what's your priority?
yeah.
Is it becoming like Jesus or is it not? And there's my Irish Catholic guilt coming through. But help us out with just what is a spiritual discipline? Do you have a definition you use to talk about them?
Oh, and there are people who are wiser, who've lived longer than me and reflected on it a lot more, I'm sure, who'd have better definitions. But in general, I think about it as spiritual disciplines, which I actually, in my ministry, we often call them spiritual practices or even rhythms. I like that because I think it's something that you work on. You literally have to practice as opposed to something you can just check off in a week and say, oh, I did that. Besides the fact that I do think disciplines takes away a little bit of the joy of it too, because it's supposed to be something that we look forward to. But
Unless you're racked with Irish Catholic guilt, then we love the idea of
that
discipline.
sounds awesome. Yeah. So spiritual disciplines or spiritual practices, um, exercises, rhythms, practices, or a posture, a way of doing life that help us to become more like Jesus and to grow in our faith. I think that would probably be my definition. And one thing that we talked about in our young adult groups this past winter was that the way I look at it, I think there are two different kinds of spiritual practices or disciplines. There's some that are directly edifying you, right? Like prayer and reading scripture. You're hearing the voice of God, you're directly learning from his teaching. And then there are other types of practices that put you in a posture where you are purposefully um, disadvantaging yourself or putting yourself at a disadvantage to be forced into a posture of requiring trust. So putting yourself where you have a need or you have less than you had before so that you are required to trust God for the thing that you're setting aside. We talked about this a lot last year in my group because we talked about the discipline of giving, financial generosity, which is similar in that you are choosing to put aside a percentage of your income, which when you have very little can feel really challenging. And actually, when you have a lot, it feels just as challenging. But you're purposely putting yourself in that position where now I have less and I have to trust God for what I don't have to remind yourself, and it recenters things. So it's almost like an indirect growing of faith by putting yourself in a position of lack or need. And one of the beautiful things out of that, not only do you get to put yourself in a position where you're stretching the muscles of whatever it may be, in terms of finances, stretching the muscles of generosity, reminding myself that God is in control. But also, you then get to see God work in that lack and it grows your faith. So the next time it comes around, I'm more likely to be generous, more likely to trust him for the things that I don't have. And that's how I think about Sabbath, which we're talking about today as well.
There's a professor down at Dallas Theological Seminary, and he would say, Dr. James Allman, and he would say, if you want to see God work, you have to take risks on God.
Mm.
And so when you talk about something like tithing, right, or giving, right, sacrificially, it's like, okay, then I don't see how this is going to work.
Yeah.
But now you get to see God work in a way that he didn't need to before, when I was going to give the 1% that I could see how it would work, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah.
And so what is it? So we wouldn't say the disciplines change us, and you've helped me with that nuancing before, but it's not the discipline that changes us. It's what God does in the discipline. What's actually happening when we do, or one of the practices, what's actually happening that causes our hearts to be transformed?
That's a good question. And I'm not sure, maybe it depends on which ones we're talking about and exactly how he works. I do think for some of them, that disadvantaging and purposefully requiring to trust God. For me, one of the big things is it changes my perspective on things, because it forces me to remind myself of who's in charge. That's not true for maybe all the disciplines, but when I think about things like giving, things like Sabbath, I'm actively reminding myself that God is in control, that he can do more in 6 days than I can do in 7, if indeed that's what he's asked me to do, which it is.
Yep.
And for me, that's a really powerful piece. I am trusting him, where it's so easy to get wrapped up in, I'm in control, I've got to do these things. But if I really believe that it was God's work and I'm just a part of it, I would trust him with that 1 day a week.
Mm. And so let's talk about Sabbath then, and then talk about what that's doing. So what is Sabbath, and what does it look like in your life?
Yeah. So for anyone who's interested in kind of the biblical basis for Sabbath, I would highly encourage you to check out the Bible Project's exploration of this. If you're chronically busy, the good news is they have a 5-minute video that does a great overview of the whole Bible. Also, if you're chronically busy, this might be the one that you need to check out.
Right.
But they also have a series of podcasts that go in depth. I think there's like 7 to 10 of them. They're all an hour long, and fabulous work. But what they do is they kind of trace it through scripture. And we know that Sabbath is present in scripture from the very beginning. When in Genesis, in the creation narrative, it starts each day or it ends each day by saying, and there was morning and evening the first day, morning and evening the second day. On the seventh day, it doesn't actually say that. It says on the seventh day, God rested, but there's no end to it. And many people have observed that the reason for this is that it's supposed to imply this picture of a never-ending and everlasting rest, where God stops from his work and then dwells with his people. And this is actually supposed to be like an everlasting, everyday experience in his world. Of course, we lose that with the fall, but then you see God command Israel to observe this 1 day a week rest period. And it's supposed to be like a foretaste. They've lost that day-to-day experience. It's supposed to be the experience you have in heaven or the eschaton or his kingdom fully. But he invites Israel to observe it 1 day a week as if they were already in the promised land, as if they were already living in that world where God was fully present with his people, and they were freed from the curse of kind of the toil of the land, which is a really, really beautiful picture. And so you have this Sabbath in the beginning, which is kind of promised in the end, but then you have God command Israel to have this almost practicing of it, pretending, living in a way as if it were true. And when we look at Sabbath rest in the Bible, there's 2 sides to its meaning. The first is to literally stop, and it says that in Genesis that God stopped from his work. But the second meaning is there's a word called nuach. The Sabbath comes from that first one, Shabbat, which means to stop. But then there's a second one called nuach, which is to mean to rest or to dwell, to settle in a place. I like the way Tim Mackey puts it. He says it's kind of like unpacking a suitcase when you go somewhere. You're settling into a place. It's like settling down into the home, sitting by the fireplace, getting comfortable. It's the same idea that is used in Genesis when it says that God dwelled in the land. He settled there with his people. And so he invites Israel to practice this one day a week, to stop from your work and to dwell with God in his presence. Of course, now on the other side of Jesus, we have incredible access to the presence of God through the Spirit in a way that Israel did not have. But even though that we're not tied to the commandment of Sabbath or tied to the laws of Israel, the wisdom still holds true. And since we're in this in-between time of not yet God's presence fully being on the earth, to stop from our work and to dwell with God one day a week, to really let him take up residence in our lives, I think is a really powerful practice. Actually, I like the way that Missy Takano said it. She's a German missionary. And she said, Sabbath is not a commandment that we are bound to as Christians, but it's a promise that we're invited to enjoy, which I thought was a really good way of putting it.
And so what does it look like? How do you practice Sabbath? Is it Sunday for you, or does it need to be a different day, given you're in church employment?
Yeah.
And what do you do not do on Sabbath?
Sure. So I will confess, this whole conversation is a little bit funny for me, because I am probably, if you're looking for somebody who is good at practicing Sabbath, who it comes naturally to, and who's mastered it, I am the last person you would want to talk to. So our small group we studied the ruthless elimination of hurry this past winter, and there's a little quiz in there. It's like 10 signs that you need to slow down. And we all took it and we shared. Some people, brave people, shared their numbers, and people are like, oh, I had 6 or 7. It's one where you don't want a high score. The lower the score, the better. I had 9.5, which makes me think that they're all liars. But it's something that I wrestle with. I probably tell you, like, I'm a little bit of a workaholic, maybe a little bit more than that. I love what I do, but I also have a really hard time stepping away from it. And when you're in a creative field where you're serving people, I think that's probably just true. It's not just ministry. And so it's really hard for me to step away from things, just to literally stop work. So I first started really intentionally trying to incorporate Sabbath into my life last fall. I mean, I've always gone to church on Sundays, done that kind of stopping, but I had not been careful about stopping from work or other things, really stopping and dwelling with God, even though I was doing church on Sunday. So last fall I started, and it wasn't because I was like, oh, I'm going to hit some new spiritual heights in my life. It was because I was busier than ever. And when I looked, I knew I won't survive if I don't incorporate this into my life. It was busyness, some from life, but also self-inflicted. And I just knew I need to do this. So I set a really low bar for myself. And I did it from Friday evening to Saturday evening. For me, that just worked because of my schedule here at the church and my life rhythm. I set a really low bar. My bar was to stop work. And if that sounds like really spiritually weak, I mean, it was and it is, but it was challenging for me because it's like the antithesis of who I am. Sabbath is one of the hardest disciplines for me. So
just to clarify, stop any work or stop the work that is part of your employment?
So for me, at the beginning, the bar was to stop work related to my employment.
Okay.
And since then, I've kind of probably expanded that. But that in itself was tough for me. So that meant no email, no checking Slack, no working on projects that bled into Saturday. And that was hard. And then I tried to incorporate other things as well. I was spending time kind of away from my phone, allowing myself to sleep in. But there were 2 pieces. One was to stop work. And then I also was trying to be intentional about incorporating joy into the day, just to enjoy the life that God had given me. Because I'm also, in addition to being a workaholic, I'm a little bit of a perfectionist. So whenever I heard about Sabbath, I was like, oh, if I'm going to do that, I'm going to do it.
I'm going to overdo resting.
Yeah, exactly. A full dinner with friends, going to spend 7 hours in contemplative prayer. It's going to be amazing. But one of the struggles I have with spiritual disciplines, there's probably other people out there like this. They're hard for me to maintain because I am that way. So when I was like, I need Sabbath, so I lowered the bar. I was like, I stop work and I'm going to intentionally do things that I'm going to enjoy the life that God's given me. Not just for myself, but also for my family and friends, because I knew if I didn't, it would have a toll on those relationships. So because I had forced free time, I would allow myself to do things that you can do when you have free time. On days when there weren't plans, like I sleep in. I cook more. Actually, John Mark Comer suggests something called pleasure stacking, which is when you like incorporate unique pleasures into your day, whether that's like we only have pancakes on Saturdays, or for me, that's cooking. That's something I love to do. And then I made time to make plans with friends that I wouldn't. One of my favorite days of last fall actually is I got to go apple picking, which is like a whole day thing in New England. I mean, everybody knows that. That's like it's like an amusement park for New Englanders. But we planned to go all the way to Stowe, Vermont, because I had forced a pause in that day. It would not have happened last fall if I weren't observing Sabbath. And it became something I looked forward to, which, as someone who's super prone to guilt and guilt to myself, like, oh, I didn't do Sabbath good enough. That was another piece that was important to me, is working on that. And the impacts on my personal life have been not, I wouldn't say dramatic, because I think I was like in triage mode because it's something I wrestle with, but obvious, small but obvious. So
it's not doing nothing. It's not doing nothing. You're still doing things, and you're doing things, in fact, that some other people might consider work, like cooking.
Yeah.
Right. But for you, they're not work because you enjoy doing it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think probably the Sabbath looks different for everyone. And I would tell you, it's something I'm still trying to figure out how to do well. The first couple months, it was hard enough for me to walk away from work. The cool thing that happened for me is that, and it's still actually to now, I go into Friday and I'm like, I cannot take a Sabbath. There's not enough time. I have too much on my plate. By the time I get to the end of Saturday, I always look back and I'm like, oh my gosh, why did I think that those 3 things that I had on my list, literally written down, were so urgent? Because it changes your perspective. But yeah, the things for me, like what is or is not work, is probably different for everybody. And how you observe Sabbath will probably look different based on the things you wrestle with. Like for somebody who, workaholism isn't a problem for them, like if they struggle with laziness, your Sabbath and how you stop and dwell with God is probably going to look really different. But that was one of the things for me, is just had a hold on me. So giving up control, having faith that God was at work, and that if he commanded me to do this, then it was important. That was important for me. The other personal thing I would say is it changed. It was a weekly reminder of who God was in my life, because even when it came to Sabbath, I would look and be like, all right, I have to do that, because if I don't, I'll burn out and then I won't be able to do my work.
Yeah.
And I had to have somebody come to my life and remind me of one of my good mentors, Victoria Kovarek. She's like, Brittany, God cares about you. So you need sleep because he cares about you. And actually, one of my small group members, who's relatively new to faith, her name's Kat. She's awesome. But she did this study with us, and when I asked her like, "Hey, what'd you get out of it personally?" She wrote, and I wrote it down because I was like, "This is so good." She said, "Practicing the Sabbath has given me permission to relax. It's been a relief for my nervous system, body, and soul. It's what God wants, and I can't argue with that." And I love that, because I think as Christians, particularly if you've been a Christian a long time, we're prone to just seeing God the way we've always seen him, or seeing what you expect. There's actually a whole concept in psychology. It's called unattentional blindness, or familiarity blindness. It's when you see what you expect to see. And the beautiful thing for me, for Kat, is she's new to faith, and she learned, like, oh, God cares about me. Like, he wants me to be happy. He says that he has rest for me, that he has a full life for me. And she was like, so, okay, like, I'll do it. And that's a challenge for me, to look and to be like, no, actually, part of the reason I'm doing this is because, yeah, God cares for me. It's not just so that I can be more productive.
Now, you mentioned John Mark Comer's book, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, which is drawing on Dallas Willard and other folks, I'm sure. But what's the difference between hurry and busy? Or are they the same thing?
I would say they probably go hand in hand. Off the top of my head, I'm not exactly sure. I mean, when you fill up your life so much that you're constantly busy, you have to hurry. I think probably hurry is probably a state of being. It's like hurried conversations. You know what they sound like. Nobody's really paying attention to you. Running around, a little bit breathless, a little bit distracted, which I think is a byproduct of your busyness. So when you fill your life such that you're always in a state of hurry, because you're always busy, they probably go hand in hand. But hurry might just be like the way that you are when
Yeah.
you're busy.
Yeah. Busy maybe those, I've got a lot to do today, but if I can be, what I'm hearing you say, if I can be present in the moment and not be distracted by all the things I have to do today, right? That may be an okay place to be, but you're pointing in on this, but I don't have time to be present with you because I've got too much going on. And is that, am I
Yeah,
hearing you right?
I think that's part of it for sure. And what's really tragic, I think, is that our business is most of the time it's not ill-intentioned. You have good intentions. You're doing important things, and I think we don't even realize. I'm sure there have been so many moments where I didn't even realize how hurried I was coming off because of how busy I was. So when we asked that question in our group, like, who do you want to be in 10 years? I just realized like I want to be the kind of person in my day-to-day life, not just like on a Sabbath day, who is able to be present to mentor other people, to pay attention to their lives and encourage them. That doesn't happen unless you're intentional. You can't be a hurried person and also be kind of a generous, thoughtful mentor. And so when I thought ahead, like 10 years from now, I'll be 38. And I was like, I don't want to be so hurried that I miss that chance in my relationships.
Yeah. I wonder if, some of the stuff, because what I know people who will, a Christian family. So we have goals for our family. I have goals for what I want to do. And I wonder if that maybe is something we need to rethink, in that what I'm hearing you saying, the real question we're asking is, what do we want to be 10
Mm,
years from now, which is different than what do we want to do?
yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. And it's the spiritual disciplines
Yeah.
question. It's like, who do I want to be? If I want to be more like Jesus, I should probably adopt some of his rhythms. And that's John Mark Comer's big suggestion in his book, which I'm sure he took from Dallas Willard, but is that Jesus had all sorts of rhythms, a way of living, and we pay attention to his teaching, but we don't always pay attention to the way he did life. But if you really
Complete.
want to be like him, you should do life like him.
Yep. Yep. And Paul says, imitate me as I imitate Christ.
Right.
I think for a lot of us, that goes right over our heads, myself included, in that I missed that for the longest time. Is like, no, don't just model yourself on your teachings, on his teachings, which by the way, I do a terrible job of,
Yeah.
but model your life on his life.
Mm,
And now I might do a better job modeling his teachings because I'm being changed in doing those practices where I'm becoming like him, where it's more natural for me than to be able to keep the Sabbath.
right. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I think about, as I was listening to you talk, I'm reminded of Israel, who we would say, well, they weren't trusting God when they weren't celebrating the Sabbath because they didn't think they had 6 days where they could get all their work done. They had to work the seventh day too. They don't trust God, and we're doing the same thing,
Oh my gosh, yeah.
right?
And shame on us because we have the advantage of, having the Holy Spirit present in our lives day to day.
Right?
And yet we just it's so easy to get caught up.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah. Especially
Well,
when you're doing good work and you're like, I have every reason to be pulled into this. Um, but it is a trust thing to be able to walk away and think, okay, if this is God's work, and no matter what you do, whether you're a teacher or sanitation worker or whatever, the work you do for God day to day, if it's really his, he can do it in the time that he's allotted.
and we've talked about the same thing and how we're kind of off mission from making disciples in some cases. Is, well, what are we doing? We're doing all really good things. It's just not the mission of making disciples.
Yeah.
And so how do we get back on the mission? And you're making me about it. How do I get back on mission, not just as the church, but how do I get back on mission as me?
Yeah.
Right. That's a great question to be asking ourselves, and a reason to go away in silence and solitude and meditate on. Right.
That's a whole other thing. I haven't even touched it. Well, the funny thing, so maybe just quick comment, but Ruthless Elimination of Hurry covers 4 different spiritual practices. And we did it in, I think, 6 or 7 weeks in my small group. But oh my gosh, I mean, they're all such huge things to tackle. So I was like, I'm just going to focus on Sabbath. And then someday I will become more successful at the silence and solitude piece.
Well, there's great aspiration there. And so, Brittany, thanks so much for being with us. I appreciate you making time and sharing some of what your journey has been on this.
Absolutely.
and what it's doing in you. So thanks.
Thank you for having me.
I'd also like to thank Jess Mangano, our producer, and listeners like you. This program is created by Vision New England, which helps us be the people of God, doing the work of God, making disciples, doing justice, and fostering unity to transform New England with the love of Jesus. You can find more resources and donate at visionnewengland.org. This program is brought to you by our friends at the Pastoral Association, who are dedicated to proclaiming the good news, uniting the church, and impacting cities worldwide.